Hey listeners, just a quick announcement. This show was recorded in late 2018, but due to some audio issues, we're only just releasing it now. Thank you very much for being patient on this topic. I know a few of you were looking forward to this interview, and we want to thank our guest Kathleen for being such a great sport and patient with us in the production of this episode. We have had to re-record some of the audio, listeners, so if it sounds a little bit funny, our apologies. Check out our social media channels and you'll find a competition that will more than make up for it.
You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Hi listeners, you know I love nothing better than a good bit of fiction. Whether it's a half-published Tolkien manuscript or a little bit of Joe Haldeman. But when I get a chance to talk to a fiction author, I take that as soon as I can, especially if that author has written about something relevant to the show. G'day listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. Thank you very much for all your support recently, especially on our discussions about profession and ethics, law and ethics, and law and professions. I've also had a great response to Brendan Taylor's interview on the 4 ways that Asia goes to war. It's great to see that everyone has rallied around the show after our 2018 mid-year break. But today, I've got something a little bit different than those topics for you. Today I've got a fiction author, but not your average fiction author. Not someone who's just making up stuff from a random point of view, but someone who's making up stuff from a point of knowledge. And also, someone who wrote a chapter in Strategy Strikes Back. My guest today is Dr Kathleen J Mcinnis. She's an international security analyst for the Congressional Research Service and is a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council of the United States, and recently a published fiction novelist. Kathleen, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. My book, The Heart of War, Misadventures in the Pentagon, is titled for that way for a reason. It definitely scratches my war nerd heart.
War nerd is quite a good way to label it. Someone who'd spent hours writing a fictional account of something very similar to their day job. So you must love it. Now, before we start discussing your book, let's talk about that love. Let's talk about how you found yourself at the nexus of national security policy and fiction.
It's that's a wonderful question, and it's. I guess my process has been something more of a bit of tension. For a long time, I worked on analytic reports, and I worked in think tanks. I did reports on European defense integration. I did strategy work in the Pentagon on Afghanistan. A lot of nonfiction analytic writing, and so while I was able to converse with other fellow policy strategy dorks in our community, I found it increasingly difficult to sort of explain what we were doing and the subjects we were talking about to people outside of that world. And I slowly just gravitated towards story and narrative and how to convey complex subjects and discuss complex issues in a forum, in a medium that's accessible to people. And so it was about 5 years ago that I decided to take that inclination seriously and start, okay, if my theory is right, that we need to use these tools of fiction, or at least experiment with these tools of fiction to explain to a broader audience what it's like. I'm going to sit down and do it. So I wrote this novel. My first draft was in 2013, and it took. But even as I was writing it, it was funny. I was a little bit strangely almost in tension with myself. I wondered, can I do this and still be a national security policy analyst? Can I be taken seriously in that way, doing both? And it turns out that actually experimenting with both types of writing, fiction, nonfiction, analytic prose, and fiction, has strengthened my abilities as an analyst for sure. And it's helped me see issues in a different way. And I think it invites other people to see it in a different way too.
Now let's talk about your novel that was launched yesterday, I believe. Now that's quite good. Now, listeners, I say yesterday, but I don't mean yesterday for you, because I'm coming to you from the past based on my very lengthy release schedule. But it was released in September, or the back end of September 2018, and it's called The Heart of War, and it's Misadventures in the Pentagon is a subtitle. Now, this is a fictional piece about anti-war activist in the Pentagon, which, one, raises a million questions straight up. But can you tell us a little bit more about the general story without going into any spoilers?
Sure. The story follows Dr. Heather Riley, who has earned her PhD working on conflict resolution issues in Afghanistan, or is analyzing those. And she's drawn to that topic because her brother John died. He's in the army. He died in combat in southern Afghanistan. So she's drawn to the subject, but she's equally torn by DoD. But her student loans are absolutely crushing her, and she applies for a fellowship in the Pentagon, the government, lands in the Pentagon. But she's consoled at first because she's going to be working on a peace plan for Afghanistan. But on one, she finds out that her position has been reshuffled. She's now on a warfighting desk and working for a woman so notorious in the Pentagon. She's known for eating generals for breakfast. And so she's got to cope with the fact that she's had, going into this desk with deep moral reservations and working for the boss from hell. And it just goes from there and walks the reader through the unique and bizarre experience of what it's like to be working in the Pentagon, but also from the perspective of a young woman trying to find her voice and find her agency and find a way to do the right thing on behalf of the nation in a place where it's for an outside observer, it would seem very, very strange to have that calling to do so.
Yeah, I imagine eating generals for breakfast would also give you quite a bout of indigestion.
Yes, I would imagine so.
You talked a little bit about going through the process of doing this and deciding to do this, and you are a national security policy expert, so you're also an academic, and you've got some pretty solid credentials in that space. And I do know that being part of the Strategy Strikes Back project, you've dabbled in pop culture exploration, but why decide to go with fiction and use that, a novel, as your medium?
Because fiction allows for a dialogue between the author and the audience in a way that nonfiction doesn't really afford. In nonfiction, the analyst is sort of explaining a logic flow and getting towards a specific set of recommendations based on the analytic starting point. With a fiction, the reader comes to the subject and brings their own experiences and observations and themes and what resonates to them to the story itself, and they choose within a fiction what starting points and what themes they want to go with. So at the end of the day, the author and the reader are creating something together. It's a partnership that you don't necessarily get with nonfiction, and that's what I found really exciting: the ability to walk people through what it's like to be independent, actually be in somebody's footsteps, and experience the bureaucratic insanity, but also the humanity of the organization, and how these human connections are what powers the Pentagon.
And I guess to continue along this theme, you've talked about why you've chose fiction to explore these themes and how creativity can take someone inside the Pentagon. But why did you have a driving force? What was this driving force to tell the story? Why did you know you had a story? How did you know you had a story? Why did you have to tell it?
The initial inspiration was actually I was flying over Kabul on a Secretary of Defense Gates trip to Afghanistan. We were flying from Wardak province into ISAF headquarters, and midway through the flight, I was invited to sit off the back of the ramp because the ramp was open and could see Kabul. So I get to put on the canvas harness and sat off the edge. My boots are over the ledge of the ramp, and I'm looking down and looking up. And suddenly I was terrified. And so I'm looking at Kabul below me and my boots, and there's nothing between my boots and the city of Kabul but a bunch of air. It just occurred to me, like, this is such a bizarre experience. How I think it would be interesting for people to know that how somebody like me, a young woman at the age of 27, who hasn't served in the military, who's a civilian, in the defense world, could end up in this bizarre situation. And it went from there. It started off as a meditation on, Pentagon insanities and absurdities, and because there are a lot of contradictions within the organization itself. It's trying to create peace, because peace is stability and all those sorts of things, but doing so by, preparing for war, those sorts of macro absurdities, but also which in a strategic sense make a lot of sense, but from an outsider's point of view, it's fairly nonsensical. But those absurdities and curiosities trickle down into the everyday life in the Pentagon. The military is known for its physical fitness, but you've got a cafeteria that's full of Burger King and KFC, and so how these things just don't quite square together. It started off as a meditation on those sorts of things, but as I got into writing and I started learning what character is and what plot is and how to move things forward and those different devices, it became something so much more. It became a meditation on the Pentagon's organization design. Are we really structured in a way that will allow us to achieve national objectives, or are we getting in the way of ourselves? Why is it so hard to articulate a strategic priority and stick to it? What should the optimal civ-mil relations be within the United States Department of Defense? What does those relationships look like when they're good, and what do they look like when they're not? And those in the tool of fiction, and this book in particular, invites readers to consider these questions and others, but again, from a methodologically unbound kind of way.
It's quite an interesting way of looking at things, I suppose. Presenting the essence of your own experiences through the creative medium of a fictional individual. I'd hate to know what would happen if I ever wrote a fictional story about a podcast host gets up in the middle of the morning wanting to talk to people about national security. I imagine it'd be about as exciting as James Joyce's Ulysses. Not that he wasn't a great novelist, ladies and gentlemen, but come on, a book about a day? Come on. All right, let's talk about what advice you would give to people who study war, national security, or work in a national security space, or even those people who participate in warfare, about engaging in creative endeavours, such as writing a novel, a short story.
Besides buy my book, of course, it's on sale on Amazon. I think I'd have to go with Nike on this one. Just do it. Try to write. Try to paint. Try to. It's not something that comes naturally to anybody. Not really. Creativity is a craft, and so I think a lot of people sort of stop themselves when they think, well, that my writing's not good or my art isn't good. That's not the point. The point is to exercise a different part of your brain and to help you think more linearly. Think in networks, think in webs, and that's what creativity allows you to do. So you can make different connections and interconnections between different issues, and you can see things through analogies, which again can be really useful. Is this situation more like pre-World War Europe, or are we looking at something that's more like Pearl Harbor? It gives you the creativity gives you a toolkit to be able to make these comparisons and draw out what that means for us today and in the future. So yeah, I think just do it. Just try and see what happens.
Well, it's good to reference Nike, but luckily we're about 2 weeks after the controversial advertising campaign that a lot of people think was a mistake, but at about $6 billion their portfolio, so I think they're doing all right. So, listeners, you heard it first from Kathleen J Mcinnis. If you believe in something creative, just do it. Now, Kathleen, my final question is...
But I do think that slogan in that particular way is spot on for. I mean, and it's essential, right? The world is getting more and more complicated, and we keep coming up with constructs like 1421, or 2 major theater, like these sorts of things, and not. It seems to be repeating some of the same processes, the same thinking, but expecting different results.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, and that's exactly, and that's one of the reasons that I wrote this fiction, because I wanted to show people how we keep coming up with the same answers to different problems, but also inviting people to consider, is there's a better way to be doing this? We have a system where DoD is well overemphasized in terms of resources and attention relative to other agencies of the United States government. But at the same time, we've got adversaries who are doing everything they can to not trigger a U.S. military response, and doing all kinds of things around the world that actually compete with our interests geostrategically. Are we bringing that together? I don't think so. I mean, an infusion of creativity into this debate, I think, is absolutely essential. I think our collective Australian, U.S., global Western, broadly defined interests are at stake here. So I guess underscore. I view this as an issue and a debate that is a matter of urgency. We've got to think of things through in a different way. And while I can't profess to have any answers, I do think that we should be considering the questions very differently to the way we are right now.
And one way of considering those questions is by answering the final question on the show. What a brilliant segue. Probably one of my best. Now, this is the question that all my guests fear. Well, actually, no one's told me that, but I do notice from when I can see the beads of sweat on their foreheads, or sometimes I can't because not everyone wants to look at me over the interwebs. Now, this question relates to our mission to define war in as many ways possible, just like the namesake of the show, Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. Now, I ask all guests to finish the sentence, war is. Therefore, Kathleen, I now ask you to finish the sentence, war is.
War is a human endeavor. And it is, for all of our technological advancements, for all of revolutions in military affairs, it's presently a human endeavor where people matter. We can have all the technologies in the world, but if we don't help our people think critically, but also have our people interrelate with each other and understand and empathize with each other's humanity, then we're going to be nowhere. I think it's critically important to remember that war is a human endeavor and people matter.
Well, that is a brilliant definition. Well, war is a human endeavour. In fact, it's one of the big cruxes of Big Carl's work. War is an act of human interaction. People always forget that definition. They always go for the one of policy by the means. But I'm glad you've brought out the human endeavour as part of war, and I'm sure Big Carl would be himself, and I shouldn't really expect anything else from a creative specialist such as yourself, noting your book is titled The Heart of War. Now, Kathleen, thank you very much for coming on the show and discussing the heart of war, your latest way of engaging with national security policy.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute delight.
Now, ladies and gents, you can find Kathleen's book on all good book websites, but most particularly through the show notes, because if you do that, you go to our Amazon affiliate and we get a kickback that helps keep us on the air. And that's actually how we steal Kathleen's money. Kidding, that's not how it works. She still keeps all the royalties, but we get a little kickback from the distributor. Now, for those listeners that haven't yet realised, we have moved to Amazon for all of our book sales, and it's better than the previous service in the sense that it provides more mediums for you to access many of the works that we feature on this show. You can also support Kathleen not just by buying her book, but by following her on Twitter at KJ Mcinnis, MCINNIS. Numeral 1, so at KJ Mcinnis 1. Jump on Twitter, tell her what you thought about the book, keep it polite, keep it respectful, and join the conversation on using creative means to discuss important national security issues. You can also find her website on the interweb. It's on the internet and it is kjmcinnis.com. If you jump on there, you can find all the details you need about any upcoming events, where to buy The Heart of War, and reviews for the book, just in case you're still on the fence. But if you're listening to this show, I think you're already sold. There's also other useful information there. Now, also, thank you to our legends, the Patreon subscribers. You are the default legends of the show. You keep us on the air, and I thank you for all the support that you give us. Now, hopefully you're enjoying the bonus questions and some of the bonus content. You do get advance notice of our guests, and we hope that you continue to support us and keep us in your ears. And for the rest of you, jump on iTunes and sling us some stars. We would love 5 stars from each and every one of you. But if you've only got 4, we'll take 4. Hell, we'll take 3. We probably won't take much less than that. In fact, you can give us as many as you want, but we're probably only going to thank you for the positive reviews. Anyone else, feel free to tune out. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.